decision-making may be surprisingly unconscious activity. This was published in 2008, and the summary says, contrary to what most of us would like to believe, decision-making may be a process handled to a large extent by unconscious mental activity. A team of scientists has unraveled how the brain actually unconsciously prepares our decisions. Quote, many processes in the brain occur automatically and without involvement of our consciousness. This prevents our mind from being overloaded by simple routine tasks, but when it comes to decisions, we tend to assume they are made by our conscious mind. But this is questioned by our current findings, end quote. So, contrary to what most of us would like to believe, we like to believe that when we make a decision, we're conscious of what we're doing. But the full article goes on to say, contrary to what most of us would like to believe, a team of scientists has unraveled how the brain actually unconsciously prepares our decisions. Even several seconds before we consciously make a decision, its outcome can be predicted from unconscious activity in the brain. This is shown in a study by scientists from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, in collaboration with the Charité University Hospital and the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin. Professor John Dylan Haynes used a brain scanner to investigate what happens in the human brain just before a decision is made. Many processes in the brain occur automatically and without involvement of our consciousness. But when it comes to decisions, we tend to assume they are made by our conscious mind. This is questioned by our current findings, end quote. In this study, published in Nature Neuroscience, participants could freely decide if they wanted to press a button with their left hand or right hand. They were free to make this decision whenever they wanted, but had to remember at which time they felt they had made up their mind. The aim of the experiment was to find out what happens in the brain in the period just before the person felt the decision was made. The researchers found that it was possible to predict from brain signals which option participants would take up to 7 seconds before they consciously made their decision. Normally, researchers look at what happens when the decision is made, but not at what happens several seconds before. The fact that decisions can be predicted so long before they are made is an astonishing finding. This article goes on to say, more than 20 years ago, this was published in 2008, more than 20 years ago, the American brain scientist Benjamin Libet found a brain signal, the so-called readiness potential, that occurred a fraction of a second before a conscious decision. Libet's experiments were highly controversial and sparked a huge debate. Many scientists argued that if our decisions are prepared unconsciously by the brain, then our feeling of free will must be an illusion. In this view, it is the brain that makes the decision. In contrast, Haynes and colleagues now show that brain activity predicts even up to 7 seconds ahead of time how a person is going to decide. But they also warn that the study does not finally rule out free will. Quote, our study shows that decisions are unconsciously prepared much longer ahead than previously thought, but we do not know yet where the final decision is made. We need to investigate whether a decision prepared by these brain areas can still be reversed. Okay, so it's possible that we can override something that unconsciously we've already decided, but they're not sure yet. So the decision is made before we're even conscious of it. That's what the findings are starting to show. So what shirt you're going to wear or what tattoo you're going to get, or in the famous ancient myth of the judgment of Paris. Paris was given this task. Three goddesses came up to Zeus and said, "Which of us is the most beautiful?" And Zeus said, "I'm not going to answer that question. Let me find a mortal youth who's renowned for his great beauty." And Zeus picked the Prince of Troy, one of the sons of the king of Troy, named Paris, who was renowned for being the most beautiful, handsome young man on earth. He wasn't as great of a warrior as his older brother Hector, but so Paris is going to be given this task of having to decide, and he is choosing between the goddess Hera, the queen of heaven, the consort of Zeus himself, and she offers him rulership and earthly power if he chooses her, or the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and she promises Paris wisdom if he chooses her, or the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, and she promises him the most beautiful woman on earth as his bride if he chooses her. Well, he didn't even choose, apparently. It's just the decision was already made for him before he even chose. Maybe the goddesses knew what was going on in his mind before he even consciously came to a decision. They knew who he was going to choose, because the decision is made in parts of our brain that is unconscious. You sometimes hear this statistic quoted that 95% of our brain's activity is going on in the unconscious, including the subconscious mind. Now, how they quantify that, there's no actual measurement that they can take to say, well, we're 90% unconscious or we're 95% unconscious. But often it's compared to an iceberg. More of the iceberg is underwater. 7/8 of the iceberg approximately is underwater. Only 1/8 of the iceberg, about 12%, 12.5%, is above the water. So down under the water, that's the unconscious, including our subconscious. Down there, you keep going down deep. There's so much going on underneath the surface that we don't even know consciously, but it is impacting our decisions. It's impacting who we are. And I would argue that the myths, the ancient myths, they are describing, they are mapping out for us, they are showing us that unconscious, that very important part of us, including the subconscious part of who we are, that is the realm of the gods. It is down there that we have these different gods and goddesses that are inside of us, that are making the decisions for us, or that are influencing our decisions. And the myths show it to us through their stories and the gods and goddesses, and they're actually connected to the divine realm. There are things that are happening in this deeper part of us that is connected to knowledge that we shouldn't even, quote, be able to have through our five senses. That is connected to divine inspiration and to things that are happening far away. So it's not just that the gods only dwell in our unconscious, but if you want to just believe, if you want to stay completely materialistic, you can understand the stories as talking about our unconscious, but the gods and goddesses, not only are they dwelling in our unconscious, but they are connected to this divine realm as well. But like I said, maybe Aphrodite down there in the unconscious of Paris already made that decision for him before he was even conscious of making the decision. But down there underneath the surface, that is where the gods dwell in our unconscious. And the ancient myths are given to us to help show us, to map out for us this realm and the different parts of who we are, those gods and goddesses within us, once we start to recognize them, we can start to understand what's going on beneath the surface that impacts so much of who we are and what we decide and what we do. It's a tremendous gift to us. They've been called the ancient treasure in Hamlet's Mill. They say that Aristotle refers to them as the ancient treasure. They're like an inheritance that was given to us, but they were stolen. They've been obscured by this disastrous monotheistic literalism, which has come in to eradicate our understanding of the gods and goddesses that are there to help us understand what is going on underneath the surface. In 1940, Alvin Boyd Kuhn published his masterpiece, Lost Light. And in Lost Light, he writes that the boast of Christianity and Judaism is that they alone have presented to mankind its purest concept of deity in the form of the one God, monotheism. The claim is by no means true as fact. They may more correctly be said to have been the first to present the one God without the ancient train of subordinate gods. In other words, they didn't discover anything new. What they did was they destroyed our understanding of all the different gods and goddesses who map out for us and dramatize for us what is going on beneath the surface. That's so important that we need in our lives. If you can't understand why you get frustrated about this or you fly off the handle about that, it's because it's going on underneath the surface. And the ancient myths help us to understand it. But this monotheistic literalism, this parasite that comes in and destroys our understanding of the ancient gods, gets rid of the ancient system. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn in these pages says it's basically useless. The monotheistic literalists come along and say, we're going to take away the ancient pantheon of subordinate gods and goddesses. But as Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, it's like they replace all the gods and goddesses and they offer an empty cup. He says, as such, it turns out that the chalice of divinity that the church proffered to benighted nations as the supreme boon of religion was well nigh an empty cup. Elsewhere in Lost Light, he says the perversion of the original teaching has cast over the collective mind of the Western world the foulest hypnotic obsession which it has ever suffered. So he compares it to hypnosis. We'll come back to that. The strangling tentacles of this theological devilfish have spread over the whole of Christendom and have compressed the spiritual genius of that segment of mankind, the West, compressed its spiritual genius, its spiritual understanding, its spiritual wisdom into the coldest and most inhuman bigotry known to history. Wow, that is some hard-hitting language. So he compares this monotheistic parasite to a theological devilfish. And a devilfish, usually I thought a devilfish was a manta ray, but here he must be talking about some kind of an octopus, because he says it's like it's spread its tentacles over the whole of what it calls Christendom and compressed its genius, its spiritual wisdom into the coldest and most inhuman bigotry known to history. So it's like not only does this parasite suck out the knowledge of the ancient gods and goddesses, which help us to understand what's going on beneath the surface, but then it hypnotizes its prey. It casts its strangling tentacles down into it replaces that understanding with hypnotism. What is hypnotism? Hypnotism is influencing that understanding that's beneath the surface so that we start doing things and seeing things the way the hypnotizer wants us to. In fact, a parasite doesn't want you to know that it's attached to you. So this emptying, Alvin Boyd Kuhn compares its tentacles to a kind of a hypnotizing to replace your understanding of the subconscious for your own good. Now it's for the good of the monotheistic literalist parasite that has taken over and compressed your spiritual genius into something cold and inhuman. It's a frightening image, but if you think about it, it's very accurate to what has happened. You can look back through history for some examples of this cold and inhuman parasite going through the ancient world and on up into modern times and destroying and emptying out the ancient wisdom and replacing it with this cold and inhuman hypnotism. When Christianity took over the Roman Empire, when literalist Christianity took over the Roman Empire, after Constantine, his successor, Theodosius, shut down the ancient Delphic oracles. The temple at Delphi, or Delphi, where the gods spoke to men and women in the ancient times, that was shut down. The ancient library of Alexandria, the famous ancient library where all this knowledge from around the ancient world was stored. It's been written about by ancient authors, but it was destroyed. It had texts from all over the ancient world trying to amass and preserve the ancient wisdom. It was burned down and destroyed by Christians. The Artemision, one of the ancient wonders of the world, this enormous temple to the goddess Artemis of Ephesus, in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, was destroyed. And the legend says, well, when John of the Gospels went to Ephesus, Artemis fled in terror from this new powerful Christianity, and then the temple just collapsed all by itself. But other authors talk about this bishop, John Chrysostom. He's called that. Chrysostom is Greek for mouth of gold. He was this orator, and he was a bishop and an archbishop, and he was dead set against the temple of Artemis, and it was completely destroyed. According to some ancient sources, it was destroyed under orders from John Chrysostom. This is the Great Pyramid of Cholula in modern-day Mexico. This is a massive Maya pyramid, and on top of it is a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral built on top of it. This pyramid is so large, it's the widest ancient pyramid on Earth. Here it is compared to the Great Pyramid of Giza. And on top of this massive ancient pyramid in Mexico, the Catholic Church built a cathedral. In Cusco, in Peru, the Spanish conquistadors and priests constructed a massive cathedral on top of an Inca sacred site. It's like a physical representation of what we've been talking about. The emptying out of the ancient wisdom and the replacing it with something that's really an empty cup. It's going to replace the understanding given to us in these stories of the gods and goddesses with something that is basically an empty cup that's going to allow hypnotism. And that's exactly what's been going on. And it continues to this day. Here's a quotation from Benjamin Netanyahu. I've made a whole video about this where he's quoting the Bible in a literalistic way and saying, he said, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible." He's taking the stories of the Bible literally and trying to use that to support blatant genocide. And you've got literalist Christians who argue that anyone who doesn't support Israel is turning against the Bible and will get all these curses that are mentioned in the Bible. It is a form of monotheistic literalism that is still at work today, and it's all because of what Alvin Boyd Kuhn says is this theological devilfish that brought about the coldest and most inhuman bigotry known to history. That's why I believe that understanding the ancient myths is so important, because instead of having your understanding hollowed out, you can actually understand what's going on beneath the surface. And those gods and goddesses in the ancient myths are there for our understanding of what's going on inside us, beneath the surface, in that unconscious space that makes up perhaps 7/8 of our iceberg of who we are. And down there is where the gods and goddesses dwell. We have to get to know them in order to understand what makes us tick and what makes us react in different ways, and in order to be able to make better decisions so that we don't end up like Paris in the story of the Judgment of Paris, making what turned out to be a disastrous decision that led to a civilization-ending war in the Trojan War. That's why it's so important to get to know the gods and goddesses inside you, and the ancient myths are given to help us to do that. And that's what my work is all about. That's what I'm going to be talking about more and more, and I hope that you'll join me. Thank you so much.